Hello there. So this is our second video for Soc Theory. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about your guys' discussion of the Frankfort School readings. So that's Horkheimer and Adorno reading from the Dialectic of Enlightenment section called Culture Industry. It's probably the most famous section of that book. And then the section I gave you of Walter Benjamin, which is the piece on epic theater. So let's start with Horkheimer and Adorno. So one thing you guys did a great job on this one. The one thing I did want to bring out particularly is the place of conformity in mass consumption. I didn't see that coming out. So like a big part of what's happening here, so you guys got sort of like mass consumerism, lack of creativity, the transformation of film and music into more, if you will, forms of marketing, and how that ties in with this growth of this massive consumer market. It's significant that Horkheimer and Adorno are writing in the 50s. The 1950s is this era where we see this birth of sort of mass, cheap consumption that we live in now. It started earlier with industrialization, but it picks up after the 1940s in a way that is entirely unprecedented. Which is a lot of like the environmental degradation and things that we see now are tied up with that. So yeah, for Horkheimer and Adorno, they're very interested in how is this a cultural response? Like what is the place of art and culture in this, and how do we see that intertwining with this way of producing things, right? And a lot of it has to do with conformity. Sort of a key piece of this idea of conformity is that our world offers us the appearance of choice. So particularly when it comes to consumption, we often view it as this very individualized thing. We think about our consumption as a form of expression, an expression of self, right? It's how we exert our individuality. And actually the language of individuality is tied up in this consumption, right? In some degree, like we talk more about being individuals as a result of it. Yet, in a lot of ways, our options to consume become more narrow. So really what we see consumption becoming conformity, appearing as non-conformity. So this huge irony of this. So like even if you think about social movements which are particularly sort of like what you would normally label as sort of countercultural, right? They still often revolve around things that are consumption. This is actually like one of the tensions between Horkheimer and Adorno and sort of like the hippie movements of the 1960s, which they have a direct sort of conflict with. And it's that, like, if you think about like what hippies do, like hippies are a form of consumption. It's a certain way of wearing your hair. It's buying certain kinds of clothing. It's eating certain kinds of food. It may seem anti-systemic on the surface, but it's actually another form of conformity, right? It's another picking from a narrow set of choices. And in particular, like that expectation to conform to some sort of consumer model, right? Some sort of identity-driven buying. For Horkheimer and Adorno, like that's actually, and so tying this piece back to what we were talking about when I posted a video last week and talking about fascism and the place of fascism in the Frankfort School. That's how they see fascism in the United States. Like the United States has a fascist impulse, but fascist impulse is fashion. Our fascist impulse is music, it's television, and the conformity that brings out in us, the way in which we live in these very narrow ways, right, constructed by this consumerism. So yeah, that's just bringing out another theme. The themes you guys brought out, like you guys clearly understood. The Dialectic of Enlightenment. Obviously, as you guys commented, there's a lot more confusion about Benjamin. It actually surprised me, because I have generally thought of as Benjamin as being easier to read, not harder. So even, I'm always surprised. Anyways, so a couple of things I wanted to comment on in the Benjamin piece. So in the piece that we're getting, he's not that, so some of you guys seem to think that Benjamin didn't like emotion. And that's not necessarily true. It's not that emotions are bad, but the way in which we experience emotions in interacting with art today is harmful. Another very famous piece by Benjamin, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, he talks about something he calls the ritual function of art. And here you see like a positive version of emotionality. So for Benjamin in the past, like, we didn't consume art, like, but we're consumed by it. So like in a time when we didn't have, we weren't confronted with images regularly. We didn't see art regularly. If you think about somebody like, I don't know, like back before modernity, like, I don't know, in the Middle Ages or something, going into a cathedral, how consuming the art would have been, right? It would have been unlike anything that they had ever seen. And we get reports and people talking about things this way. And so for Benjamin, he wants to claim that there was this ritual function of like the way in which art connected us with hopes and dreams of something else. It was really significant. But in the age of mechanical reproduction, we're so confronted by images all the time that it's sort of like killed art. So for Benjamin, true art is dead. The ritual function of art died, and so now art is really more just connected into the same thing as Adorno, right? Connected into this consumerism. We now consume art. So to some degree, he bereaves the loss of that sort of like emotional impact, that awe that art or music could have given to us at one time. Think about like listening to some grand classical piece when you never even hear music on a day-to-day basis. How impactful that could be. And the art produced today does something very different, and particularly if we think about popular forms of art, things like theater or television or music, they do something very different. They invoke emotion, but they evoke emotion in a strange way, somewhat almost like Pavlovian way. You can think about like when you watch TV, anytime they want to invoke emotion, they have something about children, they have something about, right? And so these very like predictable tropes pulling out emotions. So Benjamin wants to claim that what happens is that today, like we can just be led by art. And that allows us to be politically manipulated by art. Art becomes ideology through these emotions. One thing that always pops into my mind, and so to get into like the idea of Benjamin's discussion of theater, this distinction between what came before modernity and what happens in modernity, one of the figures in the piece that you looked at was the idea that in the past, if you were to go to a play, if there was somebody important in the audience, if there was an important thinker or another playwright or somebody to interpret, they would actually take a chair and place it on the stage so that the person would sit there and interpret it. That the theater, rather than going to the theater to invoke emotion, before modern times, theater was there to be thought about. You see the same shift in music. So if you talk about something from the Baroque period or before, pre-classical music, there's no specific emotion trying to be invoked. So if you listen to something like Bach, it's all about structure. It's all about the way that the notes are placed. It's all about experimentation. And how you're supposed to engage with that is you're supposed to listen to the structure, think about the notes, think about how they're changing it, think about the experimentation, and kind of like, in some ways, like positive, philosophize it. Like the like the thinker in the chair on stage. But then there's this sudden shift. And we see this in things like Romanticism in art. Romanticism being a movement of like really focusing on the inward impact of something, how people feel. This is the modern concept of art. It's hard to get away from. It's hard for us to even think of art outside of it. But it's a fairly novel thing. Classical music and music is the first form to do this. And this is when, rather than the composer sitting around thinking about structure, the composer thinks about how is it that I invoke a specific emotional response in my audience. So all of a sudden, the composer becomes a leader. The composer becomes somebody that you follow when you listen to music. In a lot of ways, that you can think about like it's a recipe for authoritarianism, and there's something significant to that. So like you guys probably, or if you didn't, and listen, if you're curious and you want to click around a little, listen to some Bach, and then immediately after listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, one of the most famous pieces of music, and it's structured so differently. It's very driving. It's very like it was when it came out. It was called the Hymn to the Brotherhood of Man, and so it became this sort of centerpiece of democratic movements. But the exact same sort of thrilling emotional response, this sort of excitement that comes from it, not only fueled democratic revolutions in the 19th century. But it also was the unaccepted anthem, or it was the sort of like unofficial anthem of the Third Reich. So if you think about that, right, like Benjamin, what he's trying to say about art is he's trying to say that we had this change where the way in which we interact with our emotions through art is this sort of forceful led manipulation. So, and this is where he gets into, and now is a good point for us to shift. Another question that came up quite a few times in your guys' posts is, so these things seem very entrenchant, right? What do we do about them? And actually, unlike most of the theories that we look at, the Frankfort School very much so has an answer to that question. They specifically do have things that we could do about it. And with Benjamin, we look at his discussion of Bertolt Brecht in this piece as an example of how art can be used differently. So he's discussing something that Brecht does, which is referred to as in German it's the Verfremdungseffekt, the alienation effect, the weirding effect in English. The word actually means to make something strange. And basically Brecht's idea is that to sort of like knock people out of this sort of a manipulative, emotive thing, he would give very normal stories, things where you would expect the audience to react in a certain way, and then he would just do these little weird things to pull them out of it. It could be things like at that time you would never see the instruments, the pieces of lighting, and sometimes Brecht would leave those out. He would also do things like he'd have characters step out of he would have actors step out of character while they're still on stage. So they would essentially stop being the character and they'd just be there, and then they'd leave. Before they exited. He would do things like have people walk out with placards announcing each scene, something that just would never have been done. And so all these things were just done to sort of throw off. He would essentially break with sort of normal existing tropes, normal existing ways of doing things in theater to remind people that they were watching a show, right? To essentially cause the audience to be aware of the fact that they were receiving a message. And so the solution here is that essentially, like for Benjamin, here looking through Brecht, a way to change this relationship between emotion, conformity, and art would be to sort of like shock people out of their trance. So that would be their solution. That's his solution. That's what would be done for it. So to some degree, it's like fighting the culture of sort of like fascist mass consumerism by fighting it culturally, rather than taking to the streets and overthrowing the government or some deal like that. Very similar, very similar. Adorno has a solution. I don't want to get into too much detail. Adorno's solution is pretty complicated, but one of Adorno's most famous books. But another one that was very famous of his is something called negative dialectics. And negative dialectics is all about the way in which we challenge, right? We challenge existing authority. We challenge economic relationships. And for Adorno, these challenges have to constantly be updated or they become stagnant. So like, if we're thinking about in terms of like, you know, the democratic revolutions, you know, United States, France, all the, you know, Western Europe and everything that happened in the, 17 and 1800s, we see them as a real negation if we're looking at them through Adorno. They negated the existing authority, existing property relationships. They created more political equality. But that challenge isn't the challenge that can persist forever. And we see that happening, right? So like the idea of patriotism in America, like at one moment that moved us to be more democratic, but now often those are things that are symbols which instead cause us to defend higher inequality, to defend more conformity, right? Less freedom. Those same national symbols. So the negation, right, that existed during those revolutions has now become what Adorno would call an affirmation. So for Adorno, what we need is this constant negation. We need to constantly negate the world. We're going to see a very similar solution to the problem when we get to post-structuralism, particularly Derrida. Derrida invents something called deconstructionism. We'll get there. I'll explain what that is later. But for now, you know, deconstruction is this sort of constant process. We're always going to have to do it. We never get to stop. And the same thing is true of Adorno. For Adorno, the solution is to constantly negate. Authority will reassert itself. You negate authority again. Authority will reassert itself differently. You know, it rears its ugly head in one way or another. And in the United States, for Adorno, where we see this in the conformity of our media, right? We see this in the conformity of our consumption. That these are essentially the things that have to be negated today. Or at least in the 50s when he wrote it. And I don't know if Adorno would say that anymore. So anyway, so those are some of my thoughts from the discussion board. So for next week, what we're going to look at is structuralism, particularly something it's sometimes called structuralism. It's sometimes called French structuralism, to denote it as being different from the sort of Parsonian stuff that we saw before. And French structuralism has to do with the structure of language. So we're going to move into linguistics a little. We have to do this because out of the other end of structuralism, we're going to get post-structuralism and postmodernism, both of which structuralism has a huge impact on. So I gave you guys two readings that are structuralist readings, French structuralist readings. And those are the founder of French structuralism, Ferdinand de Saussure. And in Saussure, pay particular attention when you're reading and looking through it to the relationship between the signified and the signifier. That's going to be the significant part you're going to write on. And I would say, just don't try to evaluate the theory. Just try to understand what is the signified, what is the signifier, how do these things relate? Because the language of signified and signifier is cut through contemporary theory all over the place. And then I gave you another example of structuralism, One that gets us a little closer to the stuff we're going to look at later, which is Claude Lévi-Strauss. And Claude Lévi-Strauss is an anthropologist who particularly uses these ideas of Saussure's to discuss culture and the use of symbols in culture. So yeah, so once again, just read through those, try to figure out what's going on in them, and we will talk more about it next week. I also want to say we're at an interesting moment in theory. So if you haven't been following, if you haven't been noticing, we've been moving somewhat chronologically through theory. And, we sort of saw sociology at its birth, in America as well as in Europe. And we've been sort of building perspectives more and more. But what we're about to see is we're stepping into the 1960s and 70s. 1960s and 70s is an through the 80s and into the 90s even, is an explosion of theory. So where we have a limited number of perspectives earlier on, we have a ton of perspectives, more than we could possibly even cover in this class. And some of these are the really interesting stuff. The really detailed stuff, and the stuff that is specifically designed to deal with problems that we have right now. So where Marx is really dealing with problems of the 19th century, as is Durkheim. And some of those things are still relevant, and we definitely still use them, and we need to know them. We're stepping into the moment where we have a theoretical explosion that's specifically designed to talk about the world in the latter half of the 20th century and in the 21st. So just to kind of keep us in mind, that's not necessarily true of structuralism. Structuralism is sort of the precursor to this sort of theoretical explosion. So we're still kind of stuck a little further back in the 20th century for next week, but the week after that we'll be there. Other than that, have a great week. I also want to say that I know that in this, in the weird times in which we're living, some of you may be starting to get personally impacted by what's going on. I know that just from interacting with friends and family in other parts of the country, they know people directly who are having issues with COVID-19. There may be somebody in your family or something like that. Just please keep me posted on what's going on, and concentrate your energies where you need to. I understand to take care of those you love, and that should take precedent over what we're doing in here. But if you are like me, sitting and waiting in a holding pattern, let's theorize. So, okay, have a good week, and I will post the next video next Monday. I look forward to reading your guys' discussion. Bye.